I'm here in Timolbil, a small little border town on the border of Papua New Guinea and Indonesian-occupied Papua. And I'm holding a bomb that was dropped just a few kilometers from here in Indonesia-occupied Papua in a town called Kiwi Rock. Now this bomb was walked here by refugees that had to escape Kiwi Rock and flee because they were getting shelled from rockets and bombs like these. I'm here to figure out who dropped the bomb, who made the bomb, and why it was used on civilians. And I'm kind of screwing up this intro because I'm holding a bomb and I'm terrified.
That's my producer, Christo. And no, I didn't send him to track down the bomb used on my house. He's on the island of New Guinea, not even 100 miles north of Australia. Yet, an island that's hosted a 60-year guerrilla war with opposing forces so disparate that whilst one side uses an array of armaments that have included illegal chemical weapons, rockets, sniper rifles, mortar bombs, the other side has been forced to defend themselves, sometimes only using bows and arrows. It's a war that few in the West have ever heard of, and it's likely that the few that do pay attention to it only do so because it's inconvenienced their profiteering in the region. Indonesia's occupation of West Papua. The island of New Guinea was one of the last places on Earth interfered with by outsiders, with most of the people in direct armed conflict with the Indonesian government only becoming aware of their occupation, and through this occupation the outside world, within the last few decades. How this occupation came to be and why it's tolerated by virtually every government on Earth is probably one of the worst stories of Cold War realpolitik expedience and betrayal of the 20th century. In 1828, the Dutch claimed the western half of the island of New Guinea, and it eventually became part of the Dutch East Indies, whilst the eastern half of the island was tossed between various colonial powers. In the 1940s, after a bloody war, Indonesia gained independence from the Dutch, yet the Dutch were still claiming the western half of the island of New Guinea. This was quite a point of contention, as recently unshackled from their colonial masters, Indonesia had their own expansionist ambitions. Yet the Dutch were feigning concern for the indigenous Papuans on the island as a way of continuing their claim over the territory, a territory whose riches foreign forces were becoming increasingly aware of. This all came to a head when Indonesia, growing increasingly frustrated with the failures of a decade of diplomatic efforts in seizing West Papua, in the early 1960s began military incursions onto the island, preparing for a large-scale conflict to seize the territory from the Dutch. As this is happening, the Kennedy administration is growing increasingly concerned about Indonesian President Sukarno's ties with the Soviet Union and the prospect of a war between the Netherlands and Indonesia, which would serve to strengthen anti-Western forces within Indonesian politics. So the US forces the Dutch and Indonesians to the negotiation table, where they carve out what came to be known as the New York Agreement in 1962, basically an agreement that gave Indonesia West Papua, with the US government itself describing it as an almost total victory for Indonesia. It's also worth mentioning that one of Kennedy's de facto advisors, the man who gave Kennedy advice on admin picks, was Robert Lovett, a board member and on and off director of Freeport. That's a mining company, the significance of which will become very apparent very soon. The New York Agreement stipulated that the UN would administer West Papua for a few years, then Indonesia, then an act of free choice to be held before 1969, which was meant to be a vote on Papuan independence. What this act of free choice actually came to be was Indonesia rounding up around 1,000 West Papuans, handpicked by the military, and under the threat of violence asking them, do you want West Papua to be independent or part of Indonesia? Also answer out loud. Also, we'd prefer if you read from this script. And that's how Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, took control of West Papua, a Melanesian, predominantly Christian, and before that, animist region. You honestly couldn't find two more different cultures. This occupation has not been without resistance. The OPM, Organisasi Papua Merdeka, or Free Papua Movement, formed and has been fighting off Indonesian occupation since the beginning. It's not an even fight. As coming from traditional tribal societies, the OPM had to begin fighting one of the largest militaries in the world with poison arrows and spears. To even manage to survive this long is a testament to the skill of OPM fighters. In retaliation for suspected OPM movement, the Indonesian government will resort to widespread and indiscriminate attacks against entire villages. Just one particularly bloody example, in 1977 and 78, the Indonesian army conducted a massive bombing campaign over villages in the Balium Valley suspected of being sympathetic to the OPM, with the Asia Human Rights Commission estimating that at least 4,000 died, but that number's probably a lot higher. The report also found that they died not just from bombings, but also killed in live burials, locked in barrels filled with water, and other means that are too brutal to describe here. This massacre was carried out with Western backing, with Indonesia using Australian and American aircraft, and this is a pattern that you will see over and over again. Western governments and corporations not only giving tacit approval for Indonesia to carry out its atrocities against Papuans, but handing them the very guns they use to indiscriminately kill civilians. And in what is probably not a coincidence, Western companies have had the privilege of plundering the great natural resources on the island for the entirety of Indonesia's occupation, including but not limited to the Grasberg mine, the largest gold and copper mine in the world, run by Freeport, the company I mentioned earlier. This mine is located 4 kilometres from Puncak Jaya, the tallest mountain in Oceania, one of the largest equatorial glaciers on Earth. Just to give you an idea of how unique the natural environment is and how willing Western companies and the Indonesian government are to destroy it for a buck. Well, it's not just a buck. Up until recently, the mine was majority owned by American mining company Freeport, a company that continues to be one of Indonesia's largest taxpayers, accounting for a large plurality of Papua's GDP. But those riches really don't go to helping Papuans, as the provinces that make up West Papua, despite pumping out masses of mining revenue to the Indonesian treasury, consistently have the highest poverty rates in Indonesia. Well, to be fair on Indonesia, they are trying to address the issue, spending some of that mining money in Papua, mostly on bombs, rockets, sniper rifles and white phosphorus. If there's no Papuans, I guess there's no more Papuans in poverty. Whilst this has all been happening, the World Bank has funded massive transmigration programs, sending hundreds of thousands of Indonesians to work and live in West Papua, so much so that within half a century, the indigenous Papuans went from making up almost 100% of the population to around 50%. Indonesia will use any means necessary to quell any form of Papuan agency. Which brings me to this story. A story that is all too common in this war, yet a story that is never told, as Indonesia benefits from thick jungle curtain and bans outside observers and journalists from venturing into West Papua. This is a story of a massacre of civilians, and the Western companies have profiteered from the bloodshed. Kiwi Rock is a small village situated in the Star Mountains, one of the most remote parts of Papua, right in the middle of the island, a dozen or so miles from the border with Papua New Guinea. Enclosed by dense rainforests and rugged mountains, the people from Kiwi Rock and the surrounding villages have limited contact with the outside world, and in fact some villagers hadn't had contact with Indonesia, the country supposedly laying claim to the land that they live on, until the 2000s. In September of 2021, Indonesian media begins reporting on violence at Kiwi Rock, alleging that the OPM, or as the Indonesian occupation prefers to call it, the KKB, translated to Armed Criminal Group, they're chiefly responsible. The media reports also claim that in the panic, 2 local health workers fell into a ravine, one being found dead and another being held by Lamex Command in the surrounding jungle for 12 days before being released. What happened next is extraordinary. The Indonesian army comes in. Through intermediaries, we hear reports of helicopters shooting rockets and drones, dropping bombs on civilians' houses and food gardens. There's also accounts of snipers and men with M16s shooting civilians. Pictures emerge of the attack, and it becomes clear that a large aerial bombardment took place. The worst of these bombardments occurred on the 10th of October, almost a full month after the original bout of violence. We obtain images of unexploded bombs and the aftermath of the attack. Yet due to the isolation, it's almost impossible to get a clear idea of what exactly happened. So I sent Christo there to suss it out. He sets off and meets with Sebi Sambom, the spokesperson of the OPM and their military arm, West Papua National Liberation Army. Sebi is a very interesting man, whose life itself gives insight into the unusual nature of the conflict. Sebi grew up in the remote mountainous Pass Valley. His dad was a cannibal. He didn't even see an Indonesian until he went on a school trip at age 12. He studied fisheries in the city of Yogyakarta. He taught himself English from reading a dictionary and has spent multiple years and stints in prison for peaceful activism. Finally, like many other West Papuans, he escaped the Indonesian side of the island and took refuge in Papua New Guinea. Oh yeah, and Indonesian generals have recently asked Interpol to arrest Sebi. Christo made a video specifically about his time with Sebi and how he, as one man with limited access to electricity and internet, runs the communications of a guerrilla army operating in probably one of the most remote places on Earth. Oh, and it's probably important to note that as this was being filmed, further west in the Nduga Regency, the OPM had taken a New Zealand pilot hostage, and in response Indonesia was rolling out a massive military operation. So Sebi was in between showing Christo around and was negotiating that tense situation at the same time. Anyway, it's kind of hard to describe what happened there in third person, and I want to still be able to holiday in Bali, so I'll let Christo take it from here.
I've spent some time living at Sebi's home, documenting how he runs his operation. He's the man in charge of communications for a guerrilla army taking on one of the most brutal militaries on Earth. Do they ever shoot Indonesians with bows and arrows as well? Yeah? Yeah. And do they work?
Then why they afraid?
Sebi has a rather large collection of photos showing casualties, weapons, ruins, and general atrocities. But he's most interested in showing me this. These videos are from an OPM meeting near Kiwi Rock last December. There seems to be consistent accounts filtering out about what happened there, yet little is known about the number of victims and what occurred in the aftermath of the attack. It seems Sebi and other senior OPM figures are some of the only visitors the village has had that have investigated an aerial bombardment of civilians.
Untuk menjadi barang bukti yang Indonesia lakukan.
Sebi agrees to take me as close to Kiwi Rock as possible, which due to the remoteness involves a perilous bus trip. Well, maybe just for me. Chartering a single-engine missionary flight, we join Matthew, the Australian representative for PNG Trust, an advocacy organisation. The mountains we're flying over are some of the last frontiers for industrial society's advancing march.